Hello all, welcome back to the channel, Real Reflections. I hope you're all doing well. Don't forget, if you are new to the channel and you like this topic, what the video is about, and you want to be part of the discussion, leave a like, comment as well. And you can also subscribe to the channel and share the video if you like also. So, what I'd like to talk about today is, I kind of want to pose a question to you guys actually, which you can tell from the video's title, which is, what is the greatest year in cinema's history? Okay, it's not an original question. It's something that cinephiles and film fans have pondered and debated and discussed before. Even as recently as last year, The Guardian newspaper had an article in which its film contributors debated precisely that in the wake of the Oscar selections in 2024. They had their writers essentially give their case as to what they thought was the best year in cinema's history. And I think afterwards they opened it up, the discussion, to the readers as well, or at least in the comments section. And as recently now as this month, the reason why I wanted to make this video now is because Sight and Sound have given their 2 cents, as it were, because on the main feature of their issue, it makes the front cover, which you can see here, is they've selected 1975 as being the year in their mind that changed cinema forever, essentially. And they refer to it as annus mirabilis, so that's Latin for kind of wonderful year, right? A transformative year for cinema. And I read the feature. Essentially, what it is you have like this kind of editorial piece that by this introduction piece by Adam Nayman, which is really interesting, and then you have several pieces, some archival, some new, each addressing individual films that were released in 1975, and they cover a kind of wide variety, a plethora of different films. So it's really, really interesting. And of course, it's 50 years since 1975, so I presume that's why, it being 50 years since that year itself, why they have felt the need to highlight 1975, particularly as being a kind of seminal year for cinema's history. And so I wanted to throw the question out to you guys. So I want you to contribute in the comments and basically tell me what you think the greatest year in cinema's history was and why. I'll leave the rationale to you. It could just be you listing what you think of the best films from that year, or it could be you actually making kind of an argument or a case as to why. But I'll leave it up to you. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a follow-up video a few days from now, or maybe a week from now, to let some comments come in where I highlight the best reasons and comments, and then I'll give my 2 cents as well, and my opinions and thoughts on this whole debate and discussion. So yeah, we'll do a follow-up video based upon what you think the best year in cinema's history was, or if indeed you think there is one, or if it's even a debate to be worth having, because that's another part of the discussion of itself, isn't it? But yeah, 1975 is an interesting choice, I think. Leaving aside from the fact, obviously, it's been 50 years since, and that's a good reason to highlight the year in itself. The framing of it is really, really interesting by Sight and Sound, because essentially what they do is they highlight 2 films from the year mainly, in their framing of this being a great year, or the greatest year in cinema's history. 2 films, beginning with the letter J, actually, that kind of exist on opposite ends of this, they're diametrically opposed. They exist on the opposite ends of the cinematic spectrum. One is Jaws, of course, directed by Steven Spielberg, and the other is Jeanne by Chantal Akerman. And so with one film you have, one of the most, it was the most successful film of the year. In fact, the biggest box office hit of all time at that point. One of the, again, one of the most important and successful films from America's most famous and successful director of all time, Steven Spielberg, essentially reinventing American cinema in its image with the summer blockbuster and the high concept movie. You have that in one hand, on one side of the spectrum, and on the other hand, you have this real kind of, at first, underground feminist art house film classic in Jeanne, which really challenged audiences' preconceived notions of what cinema could be with its radical aesthetic or formal approach. Okay, and like I said, one of them is considered one of the most popular and successful movies of all time, and the other one, Jeanne, was as recently as 2022 recognised as being the greatest film ever made in Sight and Sound's latest iteration of its decade annual, its decade traditional poll of the greatest films. In 2022, it actually was voted the greatest film of all time. Jaws didn't do too badly in that poll either, by the way, and frequently Jaws is mentioned as being one of the greatest films of all time in the more kind of mainstream populist polls, such as IMDb Top 250, for example. And so with that, like I say, you have two films that are made in the same year on the opposite ends of that cinematic spectrum. And then you also have all these films in between those two ends, which some of which were some of the greatest works by the greatest directors of the time. You think of Stanley Kubrick made Barry Lyndon, Robert Altman made Nashville, for example. Yeah. So you had some of the key auteurs of the time operating at the peak of their powers. Okay. You also had a whole host of art house classics being made around the world. Okay. Tarkovsky made Mirror in 1975, for example. Ousmane Sembene made Hala, for example, the great Senegalese director, or considered kind of the father of African cinema, as it were. You also had challenging, again, alongside something like Jeanne Dielman, you also had challenging works that kind of really pushed cinema's boundaries, such as Pasolini's Salo. Okay. You also had, again, Peter Weir, Australian director, making Picnic at Hanging Rock. So you had a kind of flourishing of cinema from around the world. Okay. You also have, and the article also highlights this, and by the way, all these films I've mentioned do have individual pieces on them in the issue. You also had two films by one of the most famous actors of the time, Jack Nicholson in 1975. Again, that make an interesting kind of match pair, in spite or because of their differences. You have him starring in, again, one of the mainstream populist classics of all time, in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, directed by an outsider, Milos Forman, but considered a kind of key American film of all time, never mind the decade. And also Jack Nicholson was in Antonioni's The Passenger, which is Antonioni being an art house director. And he made both of those in the same year. Well, they released both in the same year. You also have, in terms of a shortlist for Best Picture nominations, probably perhaps the strongest year in its history, with Barry Lyndon, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Jaws, Nashville, and Dog Day Afternoon, respectively. Most of those career highlights for the directors and actors in them, all making the shortlist for Best Picture that year. So there are a lot of reasons and rationales as to why 1975 was a seminal year in cinema's history. And maybe perhaps you guys agree, and you will just simply say in the comments that 1975 is without reproach as to being cinema's best year. I mean, just in terms of as well, the fact that you have Jaws being the emergence of a new kind of Hollywood cinema. Also, you have New Hollywood still being at its height with the likes of, for example, films that really deal with dark, cynical, downbeat movies, or serious, character-driven movies. A lot of, there's in fact, if you look at the key films of 1975, a lot of them end with kind of paroxysmal or sudden explosions of violence at the end of the films. From films as diverse as Jeanne Dielman being a good example, Dog Day Afternoon being another one, Nashville being another one. Another interesting example is something like Battle of Chile, which was made by Patricia Guzman. One of the most important documentaries in history, because not just for what it contributed to the documentary form, but also because of its capturing moments in time and in history. Battle of Chile is one of the greatest examples of that in documentary form and film. And again, like I say, it ends in this sudden act of violence. And so that tells us something about the time as well, a lot of these movies. The time that people lived in 1975, I think. And it's also a great year for characters that are anti-heroes. Again, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest being an example. Dog Day Afternoon being another example. Night Moves being another example. In fact, you could argue with something like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, it was the rebel without a cause for the 70s. Jack Nicholson being the kind of rebel with a cause, if you like, being that James Dean character. And so you have the iconicity of films from 1975, as well as the creative peaks for a lot of people, like peaking simultaneously, it seems, in 1975, you could argue. So those are a lot of the reasons that the authors go into in Sight and Sound, actually, and with a lot of the film picks. You also have cult classics. Rocky Horror Picture Show, for example, was released in 1975. So you even have kind of cult classics as well as art house radically experimental features, documentary highlights. The only African film to win a Palme d'Or, which they talk about in here, was in 1975. Okay, and it wasn't Hala either. So by Simbine. So yeah, there's loads of reasons as to why you could argue that 1975 is indeed the greatest year in cinema's history. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. So like I say, leave in the comments below what you think is the best year in cinema's history and why. If you feel like this is even something you can kind of calculate or estimate, okay? Because I suppose it does require you to have seen a lot of films to really have a kind of a take on this perhaps. But I am really, really interested to hear what you guys think. And like I said, what we'll do is in a week or so, we'll have a follow-up video where I pick some of the most interesting ones and then I'll give my thoughts and takes on them, okay? So I look forward to that. And like I say, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to leave a like, a comment, of course, be part of this discussion in particular, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And with that, guys, as always, take care. See you on the next one. And as always, keep watching. See you soon.